I still remember the first time I heard a parent say, "We don't talk about those things with children. They'll figure it out when they grow." And I almost left. Almost. Because in reality, children don't figure it out. They fill in the gaps. And what fills those gaps is usually a mix of playground rumors, half truths from older kids, and whatever they accidentally see online when no one is watching closely enough. Back then, I used to think the safest approach was silence. You avoid embarrassment, you avoid awkward questions, you avoid that moment where a child looks at you and asks something you wish you could magically rewind. But silence has its own consequences, and it doesn't stay silent for long. What I've learned over the years is this: the way you introduce the idea of private parts doesn't just teach biology, it quietly teaches confidence, boundaries, and how a child understands respect for their own body. And no, this isn't about turning every conversation into a lecture or sitting a child down for a serious talk that makes everyone uncomfortable. It's about something far simpler and far more powerful: the timing, the tone, and the words you choose when a child asks that first innocent question that many parents secretly dread. Because that moment, that's not a problem. That's an opportunity. Most parents assume the right time to talk about private parts is some carefully planned moment, like a calm weekend afternoon, maybe after dinner, when everyone is emotionally prepared and the house is unusually quiet. In reality, children don't schedule their curiosity. It shows up in the middle of bath time, while dressing, while watching cartoons, sometimes in public when they point at something and ask a question that makes adults suddenly forget how to breathe properly. And here is where many parents get it wrong without even realizing it. They delay the conversation because they think the child is too young. But psychologically, children don't interpret age the way adults do. They interpret reactions. If a child asks, "What is this part of my body called?" and the response is laughter, embarrassment, or a quick, "Don't ask that," the message they receive is not just that the topic is off limits, it's that their body is something not safe to talk about. And that's where early conditioning begins. Developmentally, children go through clear stages of understanding their bodies. In early childhood, they are not thinking in terms of sexuality or shame. They are simply mapping the world. Arms, legs, nose, ears, everything is new information. So when they learn correct names for body parts, including private ones, it actually builds cognitive clarity, not curiosity overload. The mistake many adults make is assuming that naming something makes it adult. In child psychology, the opposite is often true. Naming reduces mystery, and reducing unnecessary mystery reduces confusion later. Now, when I talk about when, I don't mean a single age threshold. I mean a window that starts much earlier than most people expect. As early as toddler years, children can understand simple ideas like, "These are private parts. They are covered by your underwear, and they are not for other people to touch." That's it. No complexity, no lectures, no fear based language. Then, as they grow into middle childhood, the conversation naturally expands, not into anything graphic, but into structure, boundaries, privacy rules, and understanding that their body belongs to them. At that stage, they begin to understand social rules, not just body awareness. What surprises many parents is that children actually respond better to calm clarity than to vague explanations, because vague explanations leave room for imagination, and imagination in children is extremely powerful and often inaccurate. So, the right time is not a single moment you prepare for like an exam. It's a series of small, everyday conversations that grow with the child, quietly shaping how they understand their body without fear, secrecy, or confusion. Now let's talk about the part most parents underestimate: how you actually say it. Because you can choose the perfect timing, the perfect age appropriate moment, and still get it completely wrong if your tone sends the wrong signal. Children are not just listening to words. They are reading your face, your pauses, your discomfort, even the way your voice slightly drops when you reach certain words. That's their emotional truth detector. So when a parent hesitates, whispers, or changes the subject quickly, the child doesn't hear, "This is normal biology." What they hear is, "This is something I should feel uneasy about." And that's where long term confusion begins. The simplest and most effective way to explain private parts is also the least dramatic one. It sounds almost too simple, but that's exactly why it works. You use correct names, calm tone, no added emotion. You say things like, "These are private parts, they are covered by underwear, and they are parts of your body that belong to you." That last part, "belong to you," is where the real psychology sits. Because you're not just naming anatomy, you're building the concept of body ownership. In developmental psychology, this is foundational for later understanding consent, personal boundaries, and even peer pressure resistance. Now, what many adults tend to do instead is either over explain or overcorrect. Over explaining usually comes from anxiety. It turns a simple question into a complicated lecture, and the child ends up more confused than informed. Overcorrecting is more subtle but more damaging. That's when a parent reacts strongly to curiosity. "Don't say that. That's bad." Or "We don't talk about that." And the child learns that curiosity itself is unsafe. And once curiosity becomes unsafe, children don't stop being curious. They just stop asking you, which is exactly how misinformation finds space to grow. There's also another important layer here that parents rarely think about: consistency across caregivers. A child might get one message from a parent, another from a grandparent, and something completely different from school or peers. If the messages conflict, children don't pick the correct one, they pick the one that feels easiest to understand emotionally. That's why calm repetition matters more than intensity. You're not trying to impress the lesson once, you're trying to normalize it over time. And then comes one of the most practical tools: everyday reinforcement. Not a formal talk, just small moments. Bath time, dressing, privacy boundaries like knocking before entering a room. These moments quietly reinforce the same idea: your body is normal, private, and respected. No fear, no shame, just structure. Because in the end, the goal is not to make children hyper aware or anxious about their bodies. The goal is to make them comfortable enough with the concept of privacy that they can recognize when something doesn't feel right and speak up without hesitation. Now, let's deal with what happens after you've started doing it right, because this is where many parents get caught off guard. You explain things calmly, you use correct words, you avoid shame. Everything seems fine. Then suddenly, the child comes back with a question you were not emotionally prepared for. Something more specific, more direct, sometimes even a little uncomfortable. And this is the moment that determines whether all your earlier effort actually sticks or quietly collapses. The biggest mistake at this stage is shutting it down too quickly, not necessarily with anger, but with speed. A rushed, "We'll talk about it later," or a distracted, "Not now," may seem harmless, but to a child, it registers as rejection of the question itself. And children don't separate the question from the topic. So what they internalize is, "This subject is unsafe again." A more effective response is not perfection, it's steadiness. You don't need to have every answer immediately. What matters more is how you hold the space. Even something as simple as acknowledging the question and giving a calm boundary like, "That's a good question, I'll explain it properly in a moment," preserves trust. Now, here's where psychology becomes very interesting. Children are constantly testing emotional consistency, not in a manipulative way, but in a developmental way. They are learning whether adults are stable sources of information or unpredictable sources of reaction. So, when you consistently respond with calm clarity over time, something subtle happens. The child begins to associate you with safe truth. That means they are more likely to return to you instead of external sources when confusion arises later in adolescence. And that's a critical protection factor in modern childhood development. Another important layer is how children begin to generalize what they learn. If they understand, my body belongs to me, they don't just apply it to private parts. They start applying it to hugs they don't want, unwanted teasing, or situations where they feel uncomfortable but can't initially explain why. This is where early education quietly becomes emotional intelligence. But there's a warning hidden in this stage as well. If parents start over monitoring or turning every interaction into a lesson, it can backfire. Children don't need constant reminders, they need consistent foundations. Over instruction can make the topic feel heavier than it should be, which again introduces unnecessary tension. The goal is balance, normalizing the conversation without overloading it. And perhaps the most overlooked truth here is this: children don't remember every explanation you give them, they remember how safe they felt while asking. That emotional memory becomes the real anchor, not the wording, not the timing, but the experience of being heard without shame or panic. And when that anchor is strong, it carries them further than most parents realize, especially when they start encountering the more complex realities of adolescence. Now, this is where everything either comes together or quietly falls apart in ways parents only notice years later. Because by the time a child approaches preteen years, the conversation is no longer just about naming body parts or explaining privacy. It starts shifting into something deeper: judgment, peer influence, and exposure from the outside world. And here's the uncomfortable truth: at this stage, you are no longer the only source of information. Schools, friends, older siblings, social media, even random conversations you never expected them to hear, all of it starts contributing to how they interpret what you already taught them. So the question is no longer, did I tell them? It becomes, did I build something strong enough to hold up against everything else they're hearing? This is where many parents panic and try to tighten control. They become more restrictive, more suspicious, more reactive. But psychology shows something very important here. Increased control without increased trust usually leads to reduced communication. In simple terms, when children feel monitored instead of guided, they stop sharing. And silence at this stage is dangerous, not because children are doing something wrong, but because they stop having a safe space to process what they're encountering. So, what actually works better in this phase? You shift from instruction to conversation. Instead of only explaining rules, you start asking questions that open dialogue. What have you heard about this? But psychology shows something very important here. Increased control without increased trust usually leads to reduced communication. In simple terms, when children feel monitored instead of guided, they stop sharing. And silence at this stage is dangerous, not because children are doing something wrong, but because they stop having a safe space to process what they're encountering. So, what actually works better in this phase? You shift from instruction to conversation. Instead of only explaining rules, you start asking questions that open dialogue. What have you heard about this? How do you feel about that? Not in an interrogative tone, but in a genuinely curious one. This tells the child something powerful. Your thoughts matter even when they are still forming. Another key shift is reinforcing boundaries without making them rigid or fear based. At this stage, children need to understand not just what is private, but why boundaries exist socially. Respect, comfort, consent, and personal space become more relevant than anatomical explanations. And when these ideas are reinforced calmly over time, they start becoming internalized, not memorized. Now, here's something most parents underestimate. Preteens are extremely sensitive to inconsistency. If you are calm one day and overly reactive the next, they notice. If you are open in one conversation and dismissive in another, they notice. And they don't interpret it as stress, they interpret it as unpredictability. And unpredictability is what drives children to seek answers elsewhere. So consistency becomes more important than intensity. You don't need perfect answers. You need a predictable emotional tone. Because at this stage, the real goal is no longer just education, it is retention of trust under external pressure. And when that trust is intact, something important happens quietly. Even when the child hears confusing or misleading information from outside, they mentally cross check it against you. Not because you controlled them, but because you became their reference point for clarity. And that is what carries them safely into adolescence more than any one conversation ever could. At this point, many parents assume the hardest part is over. The child knows the basics. They understand privacy. They've heard the right words. They seem fine. But the real test of everything you've built doesn't show up in childhood. It shows up in small, almost invisible moments where the child is deciding whether to speak up or stay silent. And silence is where things can quietly go wrong, because when children enter adolescence, their world changes faster than most adults expect. Their body changes, their social environment becomes more complex. Peer opinions suddenly carry more weight than parental explanations. And curiosity becomes less about simple questions and more about interpretation of what they see and hear around them. Now, if earlier conversations were handled with shame, fear, or inconsistency, this is where those patterns resurface, not loudly, subtly. A teenager who doesn't fully trust that they can talk about uncomfortable topics will not suddenly become open because you care more now. Trust doesn't restart, it continues or it fractures. This is why earlier foundation matters so much. But even with a good foundation, this stage requires a shift in strategy. You are no longer the primary teacher. You are now more of a safe interpreter. That means when confusing information comes in from friends or online spaces, your role is not to immediately correct or shut it down. It is to help them process it. If a teenager hears something questionable and your first reaction is shock or anger, you don't just reject the information, you risk rejecting the conversation entirely. A more effective approach is calm curiosity. Where did you hear that? Or what do you think about it? This keeps the communication channel open even when the topic is uncomfortable. Another key shift is respecting their growing need for autonomy. Adolescents are not just learning facts about their bodies anymore. They are forming identity, boundaries, and personal judgment. If every conversation feels like control, they start distancing emotionally. But if conversations feel like guidance, they stay engaged even when they disagree. Now, there is a psychological principle here that is very important. Adolescents are highly sensitive to perceived judgment. They may act confident on the outside, but internally, they are constantly evaluating whether adults are safe to approach with imperfect thoughts or questions. So your tone becomes more important than your content. You can say the right thing in the wrong way and still lose the connection. And once that connection weakens, correction becomes harder, not because the child is stubborn, but because the emotional bridge is thinner. But when that bridge is strong, something interesting happens. Even when they explore independence, as they naturally will, they still carry an internal reference of what safe, respectful understanding looks like. That reference doesn't prevent mistakes, but it helps them recover from confusion faster and return to trusted guidance when needed. And that is the quiet success of all the early conversations. Not control, not perfection, but access. Access to their thoughts, access to their questions, access to moments where they might otherwise feel alone in confusion. And that access is what truly protects them in the long run. Now we arrive at the part most parents expect to be a conclusion, but in reality, it's the part that determines whether everything you've done actually holds up in real life. Because at the end of the day, this entire conversation about private parts, boundaries, and body awareness was never really about a single topic. It was about whether a child grows up feeling safe enough to think, speak, and ask without fear. And here's the quiet truth: children don't need perfect parents who always say the right thing. They need predictable emotional safety. If they know that asking questions won't lead to shame, they keep asking. If they know that confusion won't lead to punishment, they keep sharing. If they know that their body is not a taboo topic, but a normal part of life that can be discussed calmly, they grow up less afraid of misinformation and more capable of self protection. But when that safety is missing, something else happens instead. They don't stop being curious. They just stop bringing that curiosity home. And what fills that gap is rarely reliable. That's why consistency matters more than intensity. You don't need one perfect big talk that solves everything. You need 1,000 small signals over time that say, "You are safe to ask here." Now, if there's one mistake I've seen repeatedly across generations of parenting, it is this: treating these conversations as one time events instead of ongoing dialogue. Children don't develop understanding in a single sitting. They develop it through repetition, reinforcement, and emotional tone. And that tone is what they remember long after the words are gone. So if you take anything away from this, let it be this: you are not trying to control every question your child will ever hear or think. That is impossible. What you can shape is where they go with those questions. Do they come to you, or do they go everywhere else first? That difference is everything. And when you get it right, calmly, consistently, without shame or panic, you don't just teach them about private parts. You teach them how to trust themselves and how to trust you enough to keep coming back when life gets more complicated. If this resonates with you or reminds you of moments you've experienced as a parent or caregiver, I genuinely like to hear your thoughts in the comments. I do read them, and I respond when I can. And if you find value in conversations like this, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, because these are the kinds of discussions more parents need, but fewer people are willing to have openly.